This lecture is about different kinds of democracies and how America fits in to these different types of democracies. So there are two important ways of classifying democracies: by the executive-legislative relationship, which yields us the distinction between presidentialism on the one hand and parliamentarism on the other, and by electoral or party system, and this leads us to a distinction between majoritarian democracies on the one hand and consensus democracies on the other. Let's talk about presidentialism and parliamentarism first. This focuses on executive-legislative relations. So what does that mean? Well, that asks the question, what is the power relationship between the legislature, Congress, and the government, the cabinet, and the ministries? And Americans will immediately ask, wait a minute, isn't Congress part of the government? Well, not really, not in comparative politics. The government refers to the cabinet and departments, what Americans call the administration, and that's founded squarely within the executive branch. What most of the world calls a ministry, we call a department. What most of the world calls a minister, we call a secretary. So we have, of course, the Secretary of State, for instance, and in many countries that would be the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Now, parliamentarism is a system of executive dominance. What does that mean? It means in the parliamentary system, the chief executive, who's usually called the prime minister, is chosen by the legislature. So why is it called executive dominance? Let me give you a hint. It has to do with the power of political parties. In most parliamentary systems, parties are strong. They have the tools to discipline their members, and the fates of their members are tied together at the ballot box. That means that parties decide who's on the ballot and who sits in Congress, which gives them lots of leverage over their individual members. Because the prime minister will be the leader of the majority party, he or she will have effective control over legislative voting because he or she will be the leader of that party and therefore will have the tools to discipline all the people who are sitting in the legislative branch. Now note the lack of checks and balances in this system. The prime minister proposes legislation to the parliament, and then the parliament decides whether or not to ratify it. Usually there's a process for dialogue and commentary when legislation is submitted for approval. However, the real limit on executive power is the willingness of a party to stand behind its leader, and that depends mostly on how members feel that the party brand is going to fare in the next elections. Parties live together and die together in parliamentary systems. If the party decides that the leader's policies are hurting the party, they can replace that leader through a vote of no confidence. Sometimes the question of whether a country is a democracy or not depends not so much on what happens in the formal political institutions, that is to say in the legislative branch or an executive branch, but how political parties are internally governed. If a charismatic leader manages to completely take control of her party, that can be a very bad sign for democracy, even though the institutions haven't changed. It's worth noting that some parliamentary systems will fool you. Some parliamentary democracies have presidents. Germany and Italy are examples of parliamentary systems with presidents. But the president in that sort of system is kind of like an appendix or a vestigial tail. They're not strong figures like they are in the United States or in France. These presidents are directly elected, but they don't have a lot of power. They serve as head of state, and in many ways they have replaced what used to be constitutional monarchs. So in many parliamentary democracies, particularly in Europe, there are constitutional monarchs. The UK, Belgium, Netherlands, Japan, Sweden are all countries that have constitutional monarchs and no presidents. Again, the constitutional monarch and the president in parliamentary democracies tend not to have a lot of formal powers, although their powers vary slightly from country to country. Now, unlike parliamentary democracies where the executive dominates, presidential democracies have what we call legislative-executive balance. The chief executive in a presidential democracy is elected separately from the legislature by the population. So in a presidential system, the chief executive is usually the president, and the president is usually elected directly from the people, not elected from parliament. So there's more executive-legislative balance, because each branch of government, if you think about it, can claim separate legitimacy, and neither depends strongly on the other for its position. In presidential systems, bargains have to be struck, therefore, between the head of the majority party in Parliament, in the United States that would be the Speaker of the House, and the President. And this is where you get the system of checks and balances. So only in presidential democracies do you have a system of checks and balances, at least in theory. Now let me ask you this, what other countries in the world, other than the United States, have presidential systems? Let you think about it for a minute. It's actually not that easy to find them. A lot of them are in Latin America, like Argentina, Bolivia, and Brazil, and Chile. Cyprus, the Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Honduras, but also Indonesia and Kazakhstan, Liberia, Nicaragua, Nigeria, Panama, Paraguay. There's a whole bunch. But you'll notice that a lot of these democracies have things in common. One of the things that they have in common is that these countries often have problems with their democracies and have a history of slipping back into authoritarianism, or in some cases are currently doing so. So other than Singapore, which is arguably not a democracy, the Democracy Index rates it as a flawed democracy, the US is really the only rich country on this list, and in that sense stands out from the crowd in a field of presidential democracies, many of which face difficulties with their democratic systems. A different way of classifying democracies is a little more complex, and this is the majoritarian consensus divide. And this notion was popularized by a Dutch political scientist, Aaron Leiphart, in his book Varieties of Democracy. Here, what matters is not the relationship between the branches of government, but the type of electoral system used to fill the legislature. So why are different types of electoral systems, and therefore political systems more broadly, named majoritarian or consensus? Well, it has to do with what the elections are supposed to do, and in fact end up accomplishing. One kind of election and one kind of electoral system tends to create a governing majority. In other words, you manufacture a majority. Even if there's no clear opinion majority, you need a majority so that the majority can rule, and that's what majoritarian systems do. They tend to create governing majorities. A second thing that an electoral system could do is represent the people. And when it represents the people, if the people is reasonably diverse, that usually fails to create a majority, and therefore it requires consensus building between different parties within the legislature in order to craft legislation that will pass with a majority. If no single party has a majority, that party must seek allies. And in doing so, it has to therefore create some bargains and some agreements with different parties with different priorities and values. And this is where the US is really weird, because most countries clearly fit within the majoritarian consensus divide. The US also has elements of both. So in a majoritarian democracy, we said that the electoral system manufactures parliamentary majorities, and this is what the US system does, with single-member districts, which encourages the formation of two large parties. This is Duverger's law. Political institutions try to make sure that majorities can govern relatively unimpeded in majoritarian democracies. Other features that help majorities govern unimpeded include a single-party executive, where the executive branch is populated by members of a single party, a dominant executive, a single legislature, so not much bicameralism, easily amended constitutions, weak or no federalism, because of course federalism will get in the way of national majorities governing, and weak or no central bank independence. You want to maintain control over all the policy strings, including the strings of monetary policy, and so you want to keep the central bank on a leash, so to speak. And of course, this is where the United States is a little bit weird, because although our electoral system manufactures majorities, we have federalism, we have very strong bicameralism. The Senate and the House are co-equals in legislation. Our Constitution is very difficult to amend, and our central bank is very independent. So with respect to all of these features, we have some features that make it difficult for the majority to govern, and other features that make it relatively easier for the majority to govern. So in that sense, the United States is split between the two, although I think most people would say that in the United States, it's very hard for the majority to govern. And so as a result, we are much more of a consensus democracy, despite our electoral system, than we are a majoritarian democracy. Now, in consensus democracy, the opposite occurs. The electoral system does not try to manufacture parliamentary majority for a single party. And usually it does this, or fails to do this, with some form of proportional representation. Political institutions, more broadly, try to achieve consensus between a wide range of political actors. And this is particularly helpful in societies that have large cleavages between different groups. So if you have large racial, ethnic, religious, or linguistic divisions within society, it is sometimes helpful to give veto power to any one of these groups so that they don't feel like they are being run over by a majority that is unfriendly to their interests. So the other common institutional features that you see in consensus democracy include multi-party executives, so where the executive branch or the cabinet has ministers from different parties rather than a single party. After all, if you look at the United States, members of the president's cabinet are rarely members of multiple parties. Usually they're all, or all but one or two, from the same party. You have executive legislative balance in consensus democracies. That means that there's this separate election often of the legislature and the president. You have bicameral legislature, so you have often one chamber of the legislature that represents geographic divisions, like in the United States, where the Senate represents the states, and another chamber that represents the people. You have rigid constitutions, constitutions that are hard to amend. You have federalism, again, creating an element of regionalism within consensus democracies, which forces the national government to bargain with subnational entities in order to get policy done. And you typically have independent central banks. Okay, so what's the result of all of this? What real-world differences do we see once we've realized that there are different kinds of democracies that are set up in different sorts of ways with different sorts of priorities? Well, if you think about parliamentarism and majoritarianism, you see a commitment to vertical accountability. What's a vertical accountability? Vertical accountability is when voters can see clearly who is responsible and accountable for political outcomes. Parliamentarism and majoritarianism tend to concentrate power and make it, therefore, very clear who is to blame and who is to praise for policy successes and policy failures. There aren't many institutional checks and balances other than the voters, and so it's very clear to, again, it's very clear who's accountable for what. But under presidentialism, under consensus democracies, you have much less vertical accountability because policy is the product of bargaining, and you see a lot more what's called horizontal accountability, which is what Americans call checks and balances. Horizontal accountability is when a series of political institutions check and balance each other, keeping each other accountable. They're watching each other. But the downside of horizontal accountability is that it's often easy to pass blame around for adverse outcomes. It's never clear who wanted the outcome to happen because the outcome is usually the product of a bargain, not the product of any particular party or any particular institution's will. And so this is something that we see a lot in the United States, where the president blames Congress for a government shutdown, the Congress blames the president. When it comes to constitutional issues, sometimes both of them will blame the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court generally doesn't blame anybody, but you can imagine pundits blaming each party for throwing the Supreme Court into a difficult position or a crisis. And so the voters at the end of the day have a more difficult time parsing out who's responsible for what's going on in a consensus democracy than in a majoritarian democracy. Another thing that we see is that majoritarian systems converge on autocratic if one party comes to dominate for too long, or if patronage and clientelism enables party leaders to buy support of people or important groups with the political resources that they have access to in government. So in majoritarian systems, the lack of checks and balances can lead to a kind of single-party system or single-party authoritarianism, because one party who's in power might still have elections, but they can buy the outcome of those elections with the political resources that they have access to in government. Consensus systems have different sorts of problems. They don't have so much problems with reverting back to authoritarianism, but they tend to have problems governing at all if there's gridlock that takes hold. Because what happens is that if you have no clear majority in government, particularly in a parliamentary consensus system, it becomes, you have to form a coalition government, and that coalition has to be the product of a bargain between parties that don't agree about very much. And that takes time, and that makes it difficult, and that means that every policy potentially is subject to renegotiation, particularly when things haven't been set out through a formal agreement, and often there are formal agreements. But again, it makes it difficult to govern at all. And so there was a situation a few years back where Belgium didn't have a government at all. That is to say, nobody was filling the role of in the executive branch for about 180 days because parties could not agree on who was going to govern and who was going to take what ministries and who was going to have power over what. All of that took a lot of time, increases transaction costs, and ultimately that means the population, if there's a crisis, can be left without leadership, and that can be, of course, an issue. And it's an issue that's much more likely to arise in a consensus system than in a majoritarian system. As always, thanks for listening, and if you want to watch more videos on philosophy, politics, and economics, feel free to check out my YouTube page.